So with our last lecture, we learned about the structure of the heart. And what I want to do now is kind of build on that to start to understand how the heart actually goes about contracting. In order for you to best be able to understand that, one of the things that you need to know is that the heart is actually composed of two different types of cardiac muscle cells. So the first of these autorhythmic cells, are what we're going to be focusing on today. A little bit about these. They make up only 1% of the heart by volume. So they're really in the minority as far as cardiac muscle cells. But they do make up a system which is known as the Intrinsic Conduction System. So it's these autorhythmic cells that actually allow the heart to be able to contract. And that's where they're getting their name from. So auto means self, and rhythm, or rhythmic, of course, means rhythm. So these are self-rhythm cells, or cells that generate the heartbeat. One of the things that's kind of unique about the heart is if you were to cut it out of the heart, let's say you're doing a heart transplant and you cut the heart out of somebody's chest cavity, even when you've severed all of the connections between the heart and the brain, it can continue to contract because of these autorhythmic cells. And the fact that these autorhythmic cells are what is actually generating the heart rate. The other cells that make up the heart are what are known as non-autorhythmic cells, and they make up 99% of the heart by volume. So if you look at this diagram over here of a heart, you'll notice we've got a few areas of cells that are represented in yellow. These are areas where we find these autorhythmic cells in the heart. But you'll notice most of the heart wall is actually this pinkish color, and that's the non-autorhythmic cells that make up 99% of the heart. The non-autorhythmic cells, as their name implies, are not responsible for generating the electrical signals that allow the heart to contract. Rather, they're just cells that do the contraction. So they're the actual cells that have the actin and the myosin and that contract down to allow the heart to be able to beat. So with that having been said, what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about these autorhythmic cells, because again, they're really kind of the focus of this particular lecture. So I mentioned with the last slide that the autorhythmic cells are the cells that are represented in these areas that are yellow. And you'll notice that they make a pathway that kind of starts up here and then it spreads down through the wall of the heart on either side. So these different areas where we have autorhythmic cells are named. And the first of them, this one that's right up here in kind of the upper corner of the right atrium, we've got a cluster of autorhythmic cells there, which is known as the SA node. And the SA node is capable of generating action potentials, electrical signals, about 75 times a minute. So this is often known as the pacemaker of the heart, because this is the area from which the heartbeat is actually being generated. So about 75 times a minute on average, and this will vary a little bit from person to person, these cells, these autorhythmic cells that are located right here in this upper corner of the right atrium, send out an action potential. And what that action potential then does is it travels across the right atrium, okay, and it also travels all the way over to the left atrium. Now remember that this electrical signal that's being generated is the signal that tells the skeletal muscle cells to contract. This signal travels extremely rapidly from the SA node to the left atrium and extremely rapidly from the SA node across the right atrium. And basically what happens, because it's traveling so quickly, is all of these cells that make up the right and left atria get that signal to contract at effectively the same time. That allows the right and left atria to be able to contract together. So they are contracting at the same time in response to that signal that's generated by the SA node. Down in here, so this is kind of at the base of the right atrium. So this little area that's represented in yellow, we have another cluster of autorhythmic cells. And this cluster of autorhythmic cells is what's known as the atrioventricular, or the AV node. So what happens with the signal right here and about the area of the AV node is it was traveling really rapidly before. it slows down and it moves through this area really slowly before speeding back up and going through both of the walls of the ventricles really quite rapidly. The reason for this is super important. So the reason that we need that signal to slow down right here in the area of the AV node is that we need to be able to give the atria time to get the signal and to contract before we send that signal to contract down into the ventricles. So that's why we get a slowing in that action potential or that electrical signal that tells the heart muscle to contract right through here. We want to give, again, the atria, both the right and the left, time to get the signal, time to contract, time to finish contracting before we send that signal for contraction down into the right ventricle and also into the left ventricle. If that were not the case, if we didn't slow down that signal right here, what would happen is that all areas of the heart, because that signal moves so quickly up through here, all areas of the heart would effectively get that signal to contract at the same time. That means that the ventricles would be contracting at the same time that the atria are contracting. And of course, when the ventricles contract, they are generating a back pressure. And when the atria contract, they're generating a forward pressure. And so if they are contracting at the same time, basically what would happen is those chambers would be working against each other. And so we slow down that signal right there at the AV node, again, so the atria can finish contracting before the ventricles get the signal and then contract in response to it. So we've talked about the SA node, the pacemaker that's kind of setting the pace for the heart. It sends out signals 75 times a minute, causing the atria to contract as a unit. And then that signal gets picked up down in here by what's known as the AV node. The signal slows down so that those atria have an opportunity to contract before moving down through these autorhythmic cells that are located throughout the rest of the heart wall. So the next area where we have autorhythmic cells is right through here. They form a pathway which is known as the AV bundle. It's also sometimes referred to as the bundle of His. So despite the fact that this is spelled like bundle of His, it's pronounced bundle of His. So this area is through there. And then you'll notice that this bundle of His right in this area right here divides into two different pathways. So down here where we've got the bundle that has divided into these two different pathways of autorhythmic cells, we have what are known as the bundle branches. So you'll sometimes hear these referred to as right bundle branches and left bundle branches, or we can just collectively call them the bundle branches. You'll notice that this left bundle branch goes down and then it goes up into the wall of the left ventricle. So out in here, we've also got these pathways of autorhythmic cells, which are known as Purkinje fibers. The right bundle branch, if you follow it down, goes up into the wall of the right ventricle, where we have, again, autorhythmic cells that are represented in yellow that are also known as Purkinje fibers. But what these bundle branches do, because they split, is they allow us to send that signal to the left ventricle and send that signal to the right ventricle at the same time, so that these ventricles can contract as a unit, so that they're contracting at the same time. The other thing that you should know is once the signal has slowed down up in here, atria finish contracting, and now that signal zips very rapidly through the ventricles, so that basically all of the ventricles on both the right side and the left side are getting that signal to contract at the same time. I talked about previously the idea that the SA node, which remember is our pacemaker, it's this area of autorhythmic cells up here in the corner of the right atrium, that it has an intrinsic rate, which means that 75 times a minute on average, it's generating electrical signals, and those electrical signals are spreading across the atria and across the ventricles. You'll notice that the AV node and the AV bundle and the bundle branches and actually the Purkinje fibers as well all have an intrinsic rate also. So they are autorhythmic cells, which means if they need to, they can generate their own electrical signals to cause the heart to contract. However, because the SA node has the fastest intrinsic rate, usually what happens is that the electrical signals that are coming from the SA node override signals that would be generated by any other area of the intrinsic conduction system. And so normally the AV node, the AV bundle, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers aren't generating their own signals. They are just transferring signals 75 times a minute in response to what's happening with the SA node. However, there are situations where you can have damage to the SA node or damage to some other area along the intrinsic conduction system. So I want to go with the idea of having damage to the SA node. Let's say somebody has a congenital birth defect, or maybe they've had a heart attack and this area of tissue up here in the SA node has died. Now, all of a sudden, what we lose is the function of the SA node and its ability to generate an electrical signal that spreads across the atria 75 times a minute. If that happens, then remember the AV node is still autorhythmic cells. It's part of the intrinsic conduction system, and it also has an intrinsic rate, and it's capable of generating electrical signals or action potentials to tell the heart to contract, albeit at a slower pace. So the intrinsic rate of the AV node is about 50 times a minute. So if your SA node were to be damaged for whatever reason, what would generally happen is the AV node would take over as the pacemaker of the heart. It would continue to generate electrical signals, and it would send those signals out to the ventricles about 50 times a minute. So your heart would still be able to beat, or at least the ventricles would be able to beat. It just wouldn't be as rapid as you would see happening if the SA node were not damaged. Here's another scenario that I want you to think about, because this one actually comes up on the activity that you do for today. So let's imagine that the SA node is fine. The bundle of hits and bundle branches and Purkinje fibers are all fine, but we've had a heart attack or we've had some type of damage that takes out the AV node. So now all of a sudden we have a situation where the SA node is working just fine. It's sending electrical signals across the atria 75 times a minute. The atria are contracting in response to that 75 times a minute, but there's nothing down here, because it's been damaged, to pick up that signal from the SA node and transfer it down into the ventricles. If that were to happen, what would then occur in the heart is the AV bundle would take over. So if the AV node can't pass the signal from the SA node to the AV bundle, then the AV bundle, okay, remember it's intrinsic cells too, it will start generating its own electrical signals and passing them basically downstream from where the AV bundle is. So the intrinsic rate of the AV bundle is even slower than the intrinsic rate of the AV node. The AV bundle is capable of generating electrical signals telling the heart to contract about 30 times a minute. So 30 times a minute in this particular scenario, you would get a signal telling the ventricles to contract. But remember, 75 times a minute, you were getting a signal that was telling the atria to contract. So the atria are contracting almost 3 times as much as the ventricles are contracting in that particular scenario. So I bring this up just because you're going to be playing with EKGs in the activity you do in this particular folder, and that's one of the scenarios that you actually see as a heart block where there's damage to the AV node, and now you've got signals being generated here that are spreading to the ventricles and signals being generated up in here that are spreading to the atria, but the atria and the ventricles are not coordinated and they're not contracting in a rhythmic pattern with each other. So the last thing that I want to look at today is just some very brief introductory stuff on EKGs. So an EKG is a reading of the electrical activity in the heart. I see a lot of confusion with this. So some people think it's like actually measuring the heartbeat, or it's measuring the opening and closing of valves, or it's detecting heart sounds or something like that. It is not. What an EKG is measuring, and you should be very, very clear on this, is that electrical activity that's occurring within the heart. So those action potentials that are being generated by the SA node and then spreading throughout the rest of the heart, like we talked about in the last slide. That's what an EKG is measuring. If the electrical signals are messed up, if there's something that's weird about them, because they are the signal to contract, there's likely going to be a problem with the contraction. But an EKG or an ECG, whatever you prefer, is not actually measuring the contraction. It's measuring the electrical signals as they spread through a heart. So most of you are probably somewhat familiar with EKG reading. So here's one here, just a normal regular heartbeat. And what you'll notice is we've got kind of this pattern of waves that repeats, and this would be considered normal. What I want to do is take this pattern of waves and break it down so that you understand what each one of these waves is representing. So we've got one complete heartbeat, okay, represented in this little area here. Here's a second complete heartbeat, okay, here's a third one here, or at least this is representing the waves that are causing that heartbeat. And so over here we've got one complete heartbeat, or again, the waves that are causing that heartbeat represent. Notice it's kind of this repeating pattern. So the first wave is what's known as the P wave, and then we've got this, what's known as a QRS complex, which is actually three separate waves, Q, R, and S, but we refer to them usually together as the QRS complex. And then a little bit later over here, we've got a T wave, and we're not even going to worry about the U wave for the sake of this class, okay? So if you take this back to this, here's a P wave, QRS complex, T wave, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, and that just repeats over and over and over as these electrical signals move through the heart, causing the contraction of the heart to actually occur. Now, what I want you to notice is if you look at this diagram where we've got the P, QRS complex, and T wave represented, if you go just below it, we've got an artist's representation of a heart, and there's a portion of that heart that's highlighted. So in this one here, the atria, the walls of the atria are highlighted, and that's matched up with the P wave. And the reason for this is it is during the P wave that the atria are actually depolarizing. So that electrical signal that's being generated by the SA node is spreading across the atria during the time of the P wave. If you look over here at the QRS complex and you match that up with what's going on, here we've got the ventricles highlighted, and that's because the QRS complex represents the time when the electrical signal is traveling through the ventricles. So specifically when the depolarization of that electrical signal is traveling through the ventricles. If you look over here at the T wave represents the repolarization or the recovery wave of the ventricles. So we've talked about depolarization of the atria, depolarization of the ventricles, repolarization of the ventricles. You may remember from 227 that anytime you've got an electrical signal or you've got an action potential, that consists of a depolarization followed by a repolarization. But we haven't talked about where on an EKG the repolarization of the atria is actually represented. The reason for that is repolarization of the atria happens during the QRS complex. So it happens at the same time that the ventricles are actually depolarizing. This is a much bigger electrical activity, this ventricular depolarization, than is the atrial repolarization. And for that reason, what's going on in the ventricles kind of masks what's going on in the atria, and you don't have a wave that shows up that represents atrial repolarization. But this should help you to kind of match up these different waves with what's actually going on with electrical signals moving across the heart itself. Now, with this having been said, one of the things that you can get from an EKG, now that you know kind of what it's representing, that it's looking at the electrical signals and where the electrical signals are happening, is you can also get the timing of everything. So back in the day, before this was computer automated, what used to happen with an EKG is you had this grid paper and it would scroll through a machine, and as it was scrolling through a machine, it would take a certain amount of time for the paper to go from there to there and from there to there, and that was a consistent set time. And based on that, you could start getting the timing that it's taking for the atria to depolarize, how long it takes for the ventricles to depolarize, how long it takes for the ventricles to repolarize, and so forth. Here's why. If you think about each one of these squares being equal to 0.1 seconds, and I'm just making up time here, what that means is for this P wave, if you took each one of these squares and added them up, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares basically that this P wave took. We know each one of those squares was 0.1 seconds. Now we know that the P wave took 0.6 seconds to occur. So it took 6 seconds for the atria to actually depolarize. Sometimes if somebody has heart damage, you'll see this P wave being really extended, and that basically means it's taking a longer period of time for the wave, the electrical signal, to actually move across the atria. This may happen because there's scar tissue or something like that that's actually slowing down the wave. Another thing that you'll see commonly is the waves will be inverted. So the P wave is normally in this direction, Q dips down, R goes back up, S dips down, and then T goes back up. Sometimes you'll start to see inverted waves. So for example, after a heart attack, it's very common to see a T wave that actually is upside down. So rather than having it go up like it does, you might see a T wave that's now starting to do this. That's an inverted wave, and that is just an indication that there has been damage to the tissue, and because of that damage, the electrical signal's having to take a different pathway than it normally would. That change in pathway is going to change the deflection wave and the shape of that wave and what it actually looks like. So if you think about this, we go back again to this normal heartbeat. Okay, we've got a P wave, QRS complex, T wave. Here's another P wave, QRS complex, T wave. We know that each one of these is, we'll say 0.1 seconds. I don't even know if that's true back in the day when they used to run EKGs through this graph paper, but let's say it is. We could figure out how often the heart is beating by calculating the amount of time that it is required for these electrical signals to move fully through the heart in a depolarization and repolarization. So we start here, and here's where those signals have finished and the heartbeat should have finished, and here's where those signals have finished again and the heartbeat should have finished. It's kind of hard to go from P wave to P wave. What I like to do actually is go from the tip of the R to the tip of the R, because those are a lot easier to see. So if you look at that, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 squares in there. We said that each of those were 0.1 seconds. So basically every 0.4 seconds, the heart is contracting according to this particular EKG. Now, if you look at this one down here, you'll notice that those waves are much closer together. So it's not taking as much time for them to happen. This is what you would see with a faster heartbeat on an EKG. Here, they're more spaced out from each other. So it's taking a longer period of time for the electrical signals. The heart's beating slower in response to that. And down here, we've got just an irregular heart rate. So sometimes they're really close together, sometimes it's taking longer, sometimes they're kind of average, because the heart isn't really beating with a consistent rhythm in this particular situation. So this is some really kind of baseline 101 introduction to learning about an EKG and the type of information that it's going to be able to tell you. And you'll need this as you're working on your activity for this week.